She only wanted to give her virginity to someone she loved. Instead, she gave it to a stranger in a hotel room. A man whose name she never asked, whose face she tried not to memorize, and whose voice still echoed in her ears like a song she couldn't forget. Eva Martin was not the kind of girl who took chances, who stayed out late, who let herself be touched by mystery or impulse. Yet last night had unfolded like something out of someone else's life, a night wrapped in quiet conversation and breathless silence, ending not in regret, but in disbelief. Now, walking down the marble hallway of the Grand Haven Hotel, barefoot and carrying her broken heels in one hand, she tried to piece together how everything had unraveled in a matter of hours, how one decision, one moment of surrender had shifted the ground beneath her feet. Her dress clung to her skin, wrinkled and loose, a visible trace of what she had tried to convince herself was just one mistake, a beautiful, dangerous mistake, made in the dark when no one was supposed to see her. She had left before sunrise, without saying goodbye, without asking his name or giving hers, just a folded note on the nightstand that said, "Thank you for the kindness. I was saving it for love, and for a moment I thought maybe you were it." She had expected the weight of shame, but what she felt was something different, something she didn't know how to name, like longing mixed with confusion, like grief for a version of herself that no longer existed. Her phone buzzed as she stepped into the cool morning air, the city just beginning to stir, and her eyes scanned the screen without emotion, reading the message that had waited all night. "Contract signing today, noon, bring identification." She stared at the words, trying to match them to the world she had just stepped out of, trying to remember who she was before she walked into that bar, before she met the man who looked at her like she was more than a body, more than a transaction, more than a name on a paper. She had agreed to marry someone she had never met, not for love, not for dreams, but for money, for survival, for her sister's surgery and her mother's debts. And the conditions had been clear: 6 months of marriage, public appearances, 0 intimacy, 0 expectation, a clean divorce after the contract expired. She had promised herself she would not give him anything more than her signature, not her heart, not her body, not the part of her that still believed in something real, but last night had broken that vow, not out of weakness, but out of something more complicated, something she didn't dare call hope. The man she had chosen for that one night had held her like she was glass, spoken to her like she mattered, touched her like she had never been touched before, and now she was about to face the man she was contractually bound to marry, to fake a life with, to share a last name with, and she would have to pretend none of this had happened. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly suspect, was that the man in the hotel room, the man whose hands still haunted her skin, whose breath still lived somewhere between her ribs, was the very same man she would meet in that cold boardroom at noon. He was the billionaire behind the contract, the ghost in the hallway, the stranger she had already given everything to, and unlike her, he already knew exactly who she was. Eva Martin was 24 years old and already felt like life had aged her twice that, not in years, but in weight, in responsibility, in the constant stretch between what she wanted and what she had to do to keep her world from falling apart. Her days were spent under the pale fluorescent lights of a community clinic in Queens, where she worked as a nurse assistant, logging double shifts to keep her mother's medication stocked and her sister's heart condition monitored, while her nights were quiet, usually sleepless, filled with budgeting spreadsheets and quiet prayers, hoping that someday her life would feel less like survival and more like living. Her father had left when she was 11, leaving behind a trail of bills and promises, and since then it had always been the 3 of them, each taking turns being strong for the other, though lately it was Eva who bore most of the burden. Her sister Leah was 16, brilliant and brave, with a smile that could light up even the darkest nights, but her heart was broken, literally, and the surgery she needed cost more than Eva could earn in 3 years, even with 3 jobs. That was when the offer came, strange and sterile, delivered in a manila envelope through a lawyer with a forgettable face and a voice that carried the kind of authority money always did, the kind that made impossible things sound reasonable. The proposal was simple. At least on paper, enter into a 6-month legal marriage with a man who needed a wife for reasons undisclosed, play the role in public, follow the guidelines provided, attend events when necessary, and at the end of the term, walk away with $500,000, no strings attached. It sounded absurd, like something out of a bad romantic comedy. Except it wasn't fiction, it was her reality. And for the first time in her life, she had a chance to buy her sister a future. The contract had clauses, of course, long paragraphs about image control and non-disclosure, about wardrobe expectations and location requirements, but the most important clause, the one that made Eva agree, was the assurance that no physical relationship would be required, that intimacy would not be part of the arrangement, that she could keep her boundaries intact. That mattered to her more than anything, because despite the chaos around her, despite the crushing weight of necessity, she had held on to that one quiet part of herself, the part she had promised to save until she met someone who looked at her and truly saw her, not as a burden, not as a charity case, not as a body, but as a person worth choosing. That promise had kept her steady, until the night she broke it with a stranger whose eyes said everything he never voiced, a man who gave her no name, but left her with a feeling she couldn't shake. Meanwhile, the man on the other side of the contract had built a life that looked perfect on paper, but felt like a cage. Grayson Wolfe was 30 years old, the youngest CEO in the history of Wolfe Biomedical, a corporation valued at over $17 billion, spanning from elite hospitals to research labs, with his name attached to everything from state-of-the-art surgical robotics to national telehealth platforms. He was brilliant, calculating, and cold in the way only power could afford, raised in silence behind the steel gates of a Greenwich estate where affection was rare and expectations were high. His father, Malcolm Wolfe, had been a legend in the medical tech world, ruthless and revered, and when he died unexpectedly 3 years ago, the board handed the empire to Grayson, who turned it into something even larger, something sleeker and more impenetrable. But the cost was steep, and the price was personal. The board, made up of aging men who still clung to the illusion of legacy, had added a clause to his continued leadership appear more grounded, more stable, more human, which in their minds meant married. The marriage didn't have to be real, just convincing enough to appear on magazine covers, just steady enough to calm investors, and so a legal team was instructed to find someone who could pass as a wife without the risks of love. Someone clean, uncontroversial, and easy to control. Grayson had approved the list of candidates without much thought until he saw Eva's file, her eyes staring back from a passport photo that didn't do her justice, her background modest, her records clean, her need obvious. Something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way her handwriting curved in her signature, the way she always signed with the full name, Eva Noel Martin, as if every part of her mattered. He didn't know then that they would meet before the contract began, not as husband and wife, not even as strangers on paper, but as two tired souls colliding in a moment neither of them could explain. He didn't plan on approaching her that night, didn't know she was the same girl from the file, only that she sat alone at the edge of a quiet rooftop bar, looking like the world had forgotten how to be kind to her. And something inside him, something buried and long dormant, told him to sit down. And so he did. And from that moment, the contract stopped being a transaction and began to feel like fate disguised as business. Eva had never believed in coincidence. She believed in patterns, in the quiet rhythm of things falling apart and coming together only when survival demanded it. So the fact that she had met him, shared her most intimate self with him, and then discovered he was the man behind the contract, her fiancé in name, and now something else entirely, felt less like a twist of fate and more like a storm she hadn't seen coming. She kept her posture straight as she stepped into the penthouse office where the contract was to be finalized, her fingers tightly wrapped around the envelope that held her identification, and when the assistant opened the door and gestured for her to enter, she felt her breath catch in her throat as her eyes landed on him. He stood by the window, tall and still, dressed in a gray tailored suit that looked effortless on him, as if the fabric had been cut to obey him, not just fit him. And when he turned to look at her, his eyes met hers without surprise, without hesitation, just calm observation, the kind of look that said he had already known. He didn't speak immediately, just offered a small nod, then gestured toward the chair across from his desk, his voice even and professional when he finally said, "Thank you for coming in, Ava." She sat down, the leather chair swallowing her, her mind still racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening, trying to piece together whether this was some kind of game or test or punishment, and whether he would use what happened between them as leverage, though something in her gut told her he wouldn't. The papers were laid out in front of her, the contract exactly as she had seen it before, every clause printed in sharp legal language, every paragraph as cold and calculated as the city's skyline behind him. But the moment their eyes met again, the paper faded into the background. She wanted to ask him why he didn't say anything that morning, why he let her walk away without revealing who he was, why he had kept silent through the most vulnerable moment of her life, but she couldn't find the words, and maybe she was afraid of the answer. He reached for a pen, passed it to her, then quietly added, "We can discuss any questions you might have, but the terms remain as previously agreed. The marriage will last 6 months, with all appearances handled by my team, after which you will receive the full compensation, no intimacy is expected, and you will be under no further obligation." She nodded, barely breathing, and signed her name at the bottom of the page, the sound of the pen scratching the paper louder than her thoughts. Once the documents were signed, he stood, buttoned his jacket, and said she would be moved into the guest wing of his penthouse the following morning, followed by a series of public appearances beginning with a charity gala later that week. She nodded again, stood to leave, then paused at the door, turned slightly and said in a voice that barely carried, "Do you always start marriages by lying?" He looked at her then, really looked, and his voice dropped lower when he replied, "I didn't lie, I just didn't speak." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she left, walking out of the office with her heart thudding painfully, knowing that something had already shifted between them, something neither of them was ready to name. The following days unfolded with a surreal rhythm. Her belongings were moved into the penthouse while her mother and sister remained in their small apartment, provided for but not uprooted, and she found herself living in a space that felt more like a museum than a home, all glass and steel and silence, where her footsteps echoed and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fresh orchids. Grayson was polite, always respectful, but distant, and though they shared meals, shared schedules, shared space, there was a careful line between them that neither of them crossed. At night, she would lie awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, remembering the way his hand had brushed her jaw that night in the hotel, how his touch had been gentle but certain, how his breath had caught when she kissed him, and now that same man sat across from her at breakfast, reading financial reports, sipping black coffee like he didn't still live in her thoughts. What made it harder was that he wasn't cruel, he wasn't arrogant or demanding. In fact, he was considerate, always asking if she needed anything, making sure her sister's medical appointments were prioritized, even ordering her favorite tea without ever asking what it was. That kindness made it worse, because it meant he cared enough to pay attention, but not enough to explain, not enough to confront the truth between them. And yet, something had begun to shift. One night, after returning from a charity function where she had stood beside him in a borrowed gown and smiled at cameras while people whispered about their whirlwind engagement, she found him on the rooftop terrace of the penthouse, leaning against the railing, staring at the skyline, with a drink untouched in his hand. She joined him silently, the wind catching strands of her hair, And after a long pause, he said, "I knew it was you the moment you walked into that bar." She turned to face him, heart hammering, and he continued, "I didn't plan it. I wasn't supposed to be there. I just needed to breathe, and then there you were, sitting at the edge of the world like someone who didn't belong in pain, and I couldn't look away." She asked him why he didn't stop her from leaving, why he didn't say anything sooner, and he replied, "Because I didn't want you to feel like it was anything less than your choice, because I didn't want you to think I used that night against you." Her eyes burned, and for the first time since the contract began, she let her voice break when she said, "You were the first person who ever made me feel seen, and now I don't know who you are." He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel the warmth of him, and said, "I don't know who I am when I'm with you either, but for the first time in years, I want to find out." After that night, the silence between them softened, replaced by quiet conversations and accidental smiles. They began sharing coffee in the mornings, taking walks through the city without bodyguards, and sometimes, when they thought no one was watching, they reached for each other without thinking. Still, they hadn't touched again, not the way they had that first night. Not yet, because the tension between them wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was the ache of two people pretending not to want what was already burning beneath the surface. Then came the gala, the first major event since their public engagement, held in a grand ballroom filled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble, where Eva wore a gown stitched by someone with more talent than fame, and Grayson wore a tuxedo like it was armor. They arrived together, posed for photos, shook hands with donors, and when a former flame of his approached with a smile too sharp and eyes too judgmental, Eva felt herself shrinking. The woman leaned in and whispered, "Careful, sweetheart. Men like him don't keep girls like you." And before Eva could respond, Grayson stepped between them, took Ava's hand, and said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This is my fiancé, and if anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to leave." At night, as they rode home in silence, she looked at him through the tinted glass and whispered, "Thank you." And he replied without looking at her, "You don't have to thank me for choosing you." In the days that followed the gala, something between them had undeniably changed. It wasn't spoken aloud, and there were no declarations or obvious shifts, but Eva could feel it in the way Grayson looked at her with a softness that hadn't been there before, in the way his hand sometimes hovered just a moment longer when he helped her out of the car or passed her a cup of tea, as if he was fighting the urge to reach for more and lose. She felt it in herself, too, in the way her guard had begun to drop, piece by piece, how the lines she had drawn to protect herself were slowly blurring, as if part of her wanted to believe that this arrangement could be something more than cold signatures and staged photos. She caught herself smiling at his dry humor and noticing how he rolled his sleeves up when he worked late, how he always paused before speaking, like someone who weighed his words carefully, not because he wanted to deceive, but because he didn't know how to speak without control, and maybe didn't trust what might happen if he let go. One evening after dinner, he asked if she wanted to see the Foundation's newest medical project. Something experimental, something personal, he said. And though she didn't fully understand what he meant, she agreed, curious, more about him than the project itself. They took a private car to a research facility outside the city, where he guided her through glass corridors and biometric doors until they arrived at a quiet wing lined with photos and documents of clinical trials designed to test low-cost cardiac implants in underprivileged communities. Ava stopped when she saw the name of the lead researcher, her heart thudding as she recognized it immediately. It was the surgeon who had once treated her sister Leah for free after a collapsed lung, but had disappeared shortly after due to a mysterious funding cut. She turned to Grayson, who looked at her not with surprise, but with something close to apology, and said quietly, "I found out about your sister weeks ago. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to cross a line. You didn't invite me across, but I knew I could do something, and I wanted to." She stared at him, unsure whether to be angry or grateful, because this wasn't just kindness, it was action. and it felt like he had reached into a chapter of her life she hadn't even opened in front of him. She asked him why he cared, and he answered without hesitation, "Because you trusted me that night, and I didn't forget it. And because I want to be the kind of man you could trust again." That night she sat awake long after he had gone to bed, unable to sleep with the weight of everything pressing on her chest. Memories of the first night they met, the silence in that hotel room, the quiet comfort of being held without explanation, and now this, the growing sense that he wasn't playing a part anymore, that maybe neither of them were. But as trust grew, so did questions, not about him, but about the origin of the contract itself. Something had always felt too smooth, too orchestrated. And when she searched through the original documents again, she noticed a signature she hadn't before. Not Grayson's, but his legal guardian, listed on early records. Someone named Arthur Levant. The name rang a bell. And after hours of searching, she realized Arthur wasn't just a legal advisor. He was also a board member of Wolf Biomedical and a silent investor in several private hospitals, one of which had been involved in an insurance scandal years ago, where low-income patients were denied experimental treatments without being told. The more she looked, the more connections she found between Arthur and the hospital where her mother had died. And suddenly, Ava couldn't breathe. Because what began as coincidence was starting to look like something else, something deeper. She didn't go to Grayson right away, she needed to be sure, so she called her old friend Camila, who worked in legal research, and asked her to dig into Arthur's history within the company, within the hospitals, and within her own mother's case file, which had long been closed but never fully explained. Camila worked fast, and within a few days she sent Eva a file too heavy to be ignored. It contained email threads, financial logs, and internal memos dating back almost a decade, all tying Arthur Levant to a quiet settlement paid to a whistleblower from the hospital's cardiology department, and buried in that settlement was the name of her mother, Anna Martin, listed not as a patient, but as a nurse who had signed an incident report before she died. Eva's hands shook as she read it again and again, trying to make sense of what it meant. Her mother had known something, had tried to speak, and then days later she was gone, labeled as an unfortunate case of cardiac failure in a file that looked too clean. She didn't confront Grayson immediately. Instead, she waited until he returned from a press briefing and asked him to sit with her on the terrace overlooking the city, where she placed the file in front of him and said, "I need you to read this." He didn't speak as he flipped through the pages, his face still, but his eyes sharp, scanning every detail, and when he finally looked up, there was no denial in his expression, only pain, and something deeper. "Maybe I didn't know about any of this," he said slowly. "Arthur never mentioned it, and the board had no reason to bring it to me, but I'll find out everything, I swear to you I will." She asked him one question, the one that had haunted her since she read that first memo. "Did you pick me for this contract, or did Arthur?" The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours before he answered honestly, "I didn't know who you were until I saw your file on the short list. I read your story, and something in me paused, but the truth is, Arthur's team made the final decision, and now I'm starting to understand why. That night, they didn't sleep, not because of distance, but because the truth had entered their lives like a fracture, and both of them were afraid to see how far the cracks would go." Over the next week, Grayson used every resource he had, every favor he could call, every internal investigator he trusted, and what he uncovered only made things worse. Not just about Arthur, but about the board itself, about how decisions were made about who got help and who didn't, and how money had been funneled from patient funds into investment ventures controlled by a private entity, one that had Eva's mother's name listed as a terminated employee. He showed her the documents one by one, and each page confirmed what they had both feared, that her mother hadn't died because of an accident, but because she had tried to stop something, and the system had silenced her. Eva cried for the first time in front of him, not out of weakness, but out of rage, and he held her without saying a word, not trying to fix it, only to be there. And in that moment, something between them shifted again, not into romance, but into something stronger than that. Something like alliance or trust, or maybe a beginning built not on fantasy but on fire. From that day on, their relationship stopped pretending it was an arrangement and started becoming something real. They worked together, piecing through the corruption, tracing every name, every file, and though they didn't speak of love, they moved through the world like people who had chosen each other without saying it aloud. Yet, beneath all of it, there was still the memory of how they met, still the secret that had brought them together and threatened to pull them apart, still the knowledge that what began with a lie was now fighting to become the most honest thing in their lives. There are moments in every story where silence becomes heavier than truth, where the space between two people stops being comfort and starts becoming distance. And for Eva and Grayson, that moment came in the shape of an envelope slipped under their door in the middle of the night. A plain envelope with no return address, no markings, just her name written in ink too clean to be innocent. She opened it slowly, her breath shallow, and inside were 6 photographs, printed in glossy resolution, each one taken from angles that made her blood run cold. One was of her walking out of the hospital where her mother had once worked. Another was from the rooftop bar that first night, her face turned toward Grayson's as if caught mid-laughter, and the last showed her with her sister, Leah, entering the pediatric clinic with a date scrawled in the corner that matched the day Leah had her pre-surgical scan. Eva's hands trembled as she laid the pictures out on the table, and when Grayson entered the room, she didn't need to explain. He saw them, looked once, then picked up the envelope and scanned it as if it might reveal the name of the person watching them, the person tracking them. His jaw tightened, not in panic but in control, the kind of control that masked how close he was to breaking something, and his voice was low when he finally said, "They're not just warning us, they're preparing to strike." Over the following hours, he made phone calls, sent encrypted emails, called in the private security firm his father once used, and instructed them to place surveillance on the building. But Ava knew in her gut that whoever had sent the photos didn't just want to scare them. They wanted to remind them that they were being watched, that their actions were no longer private, and more than anything, that the past wasn't done with them. That same night, Camilla called with new information. She had found a witness, someone who used to work under Arthur Levant at the hospital where Ava's mother had been fired, someone who now lived in a small town upstate under a different name. The woman had changed everything after what she saw, had left her job, erased her past, but agreed to meet Eva and Grayson if they came in person, and kept everything off record. They drove 6 hours in silence, the tension between them thick and raw, not because they didn't trust each other, but because neither of them knew what they were walking into. When they arrived at the old farmhouse tucked into the edge of a forgotten county, they found a woman named Marla Reyes, gray-hailed and thin, with eyes that flickered with old truths. She welcomed them into her home with a look of deep sadness and served tea in chipped cups. And when she finally sat down, she said softly, "Your mother was one of the bravest women I ever met." She told them about the night Anna Martin had discovered the falsified records, how the hospital had been pushing low-income patients into trials without consent, how those records were being edited before submission to make the data look clean, and how Anna had written a report, had spoken to Arthur directly, had refused to let it go. 3 days later, she was gone. Official cause? Heart failure. Unofficial cause? Silence. Marla's voice broke when she said she trusted me to back her up, but I was afraid. I didn't speak, and I've carried that guilt ever since. Eva sat motionless, tears in her eyes but none falling, and Grayson reached for her hand under the table, his thumb brushing the back of her wrist like a quiet promise. When they left the farmhouse, the sun was beginning to set, and the road back to the city felt longer than before, heavier, filled with the weight of confirmation. That night, they didn't return to the penthouse. They stayed in a quiet hotel off the highway where Eva stood at the window for a long time and finally whispered, I thought I'd feel better knowing the truth, but it just makes it harder to breathe. Grayson came to stand behind her, his voice barely above a breath as he said, I would burn the whole company down if it meant bringing her justice. She turned to face him, eyes sharp, and asked, Would you burn your legacy too? He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was steady. I think the legacy I inherited is poison, but the one I choose, the one I build with you, that's the only thing I care about now. For the first time since they signed the contract, she leaned into him without reservation, not because she was obligated, but because she didn't want to stand on her own anymore. And he held her like she wasn't a burden, but a choice. The next morning, he made the call that changed everything. He summoned the board for an emergency session and presented the findings, not just the photographs or the files Camilla had found, but Marla's statement, her testimony recorded with permission. And he told them clearly and calmly that if they did not open an investigation and begin restructuring from the top, he would go public. Not anonymously, not strategically, but personally. The room erupted with noise, half the members shouting for discretion, others demanding proof, but Grayson stood his ground, and when Arthur Levant entered the room midway through the session, his face pale and furious, it became clear that the battle had truly begun. Arthur denied everything, accused Ava of manipulation, accused Grayson of recklessness, but Grayson didn't flinch. He held up the contract Arthur's team had drawn up and said, You knew exactly who she was, and you used me to get close to her because you thought she was weak. That's not just unethical, it's criminal. Arthur's face twisted with something close to fear, and for the first time, he looked like a man with something to lose. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. Media outlets caught wind of internal conflict at Wolf Biomedical, and rumors began to circulate. Investors called for transparency, and Grayson stepped forward with a statement that stunned the industry. He admitted fault, not as a CEO, but as a man who had inherited a structure built on silence, and promised to dismantle it, piece by piece. Eva stood beside him during the press conference, not as the woman behind the scandal, but as the one who had sparked the truth. The fallout was brutal. Stocks dropped, contracts were frozen. The board attempted to vote Grayson out, but failed, by one margin. But for every blow, they stood taller, and through it all, something deeper grew between them, not a fantasy, not a rebound, but something forged in the fire of hard truth and hard choices. Then came the final twist. Eva received another envelope, this time hand-delivered by a private courier, containing only one item, a medical report. It was hers, and at the bottom, in sharp black letters, a note was written, You should know what's coming next. Confused, she took it to a specialist, and what she learned made her heart stop. The blood sample linked to the file was not just hers. It had been flagged for genetic markers tied to a rare neurological condition, one that didn't affect her now, but carried a significant risk if inherited. She sat in stunned silence as the doctor explained the implications, and for the first time in weeks she felt afraid, not for herself, but for the possibility she hadn't even told Grayson about yet. She was late. She had taken the test, but she hadn't told him because everything else had taken precedence, and now the stakes had changed again. That night, she stood in the kitchen of the penthouse holding the report in her hand when Grayson walked in, tired but steady, and when he saw her expression, he froze. She handed him the paper and said nothing. He read it once, twice, then looked up at her and asked, How long have you known? Her voice broke as she whispered, I haven't told anyone, but I think I'm pregnant. His face didn't shift with panic or doubt, only resolve, and he crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hands and said, We'll figure it out, whatever it means, whatever it takes. And in that moment, Eva knew something she had never let herself believe before, that love wasn't the absence of risk or pain, it was standing in the middle of it all and choosing someone anyway. The days after the revelation moved like shadows across glass. silent, smooth, fragile, and always one moment from breaking. Grayson didn't ask for time. He didn't pull away. Instead, he became quieter, more deliberate in his movements, more watchful, like someone walking a tightrope who could feel the wind changing but refused to look down. Eva tried to keep her body still, her thoughts ordered, but every night when she lay in bed and placed her hand gently on her stomach, she felt something stir, not just within her but around her, like a future she hadn't dared to imagine was already finding its shape, even as the past threatened to collapse it. She spent hours reading about the genetic disorder, quietly scanning every sentence twice before setting the screen down, unable to breathe, unsure whether hope was bravery or delusion. She didn't tell Leah, not yet, didn't want her sister to carry one more weight on shoulders already shaped by illness and sacrifice. Instead, she buried it deep and wore her silence like armor, as the press continued to spin headlines that painted her either as a gold digger or a martyr, depending on the day, and Grayson remained steady, refusing interviews, dodging the narrative, staying close to her without clinging, never once treating her like she needed protection, only like she deserved truth. But truth had its own cost, and one morning it came wrapped in grief. When Camila called crying, her voice fractured, telling Eva that the witness, Marla Reyes, had been found unconscious in her home. No signs of struggle, no fingerprints, but her files were gone, her computer wiped, and the local sheriff too easily called it a stroke, even though she was in perfect health days ago. Eva dropped the phone, her legs folding beneath her on the kitchen floor, and for the first time since her mother died, she felt something old and familiar rise in her chest. Helplessness that smelled like hospital bleach and sounded like unanswered questions. She didn't cry. Not at first. Just sat in silence until Grayson found her, and when he knelt beside her and asked what happened, she couldn't speak, only held the phone out like proof of how quickly justice could disappear. He took the next steps without waiting. He hired a private pathologist, paid for a second autopsy, demanded that her story be kept alive in the shadows, if not the spotlight. But Eva knew the message had been sent, not just to silence the witness, but to warn her, to remind her that some people don't need cameras or courts to erase what they want gone. She began looking over her shoulder every time she left the apartment, began locking the bedroom door at night, not because she was afraid of Grayson, but because she needed one space in her life that felt like hers alone. And for a while she wondered if this was what love cost, if being with him meant never feeling safe again. Then came the letter. Not an email, not a text, but a letter slipped into the mailbox at her old apartment, addressed in handwriting that made her blood go cold. It was her father's, a man she hadn't seen since she was 8 years old, a man who had left one day and never returned inside. Was a single page, no apology, no explanation, just a line that read, "They buried her because she tried to save me. I never deserved it, but you do." And under the signature was an address, a small town she had never heard of, and no further instructions. She showed it to Grayson, who sat down slowly, as if his legs couldn't hold what this meant, and asked her, "Do you want to go?" And she said yes, not because she believed her father had answers, but because if she didn't go now, she would always wonder what truth might have been waiting at the edge of that silence. They traveled without an entourage, without bodyguards, just two people in a rental car, driving through back roads lined with broken fences and crooked trees, until they reached the address, a rusted trailer with peeling paint, and a mailbox held together with duct tape. The man who opened the door had sunken eyes and hands that shook, and when he saw her, he didn't smile, didn't cry, just stepped aside and said, "I thought you'd come sooner." And for the next 2 hours they sat in silence, broken only by pieces of memory falling like ash. He told her about the night Anna died, how she had found evidence linking her hospital's board members to an illegal blood trial, how they had threatened her with lawsuits and silence, and how she had sent him away with a box of papers and a list of names before collapsing on the kitchen floor. He never told anyone because he thought they would come for him too, and he believed his silence would protect her. He was wrong. Eva didn't forgive him. Not in that moment, maybe not ever, but she took the box he handed her, the one her mother had hidden away, and inside were notes, reports, photos, handwritten warnings, all of it, fragile with time but screaming with truth. And in the center of it was a birth certificate, not hers but her mother's, listing a father Ava had never heard of, and when she traced the name, it led her to a military contractor, one connected to the very company Grayson's grandfather had helped build decades ago. The pieces began to align, not in a straight line, but in a circle. Eva's mother had tried to expose a system that fed on vulnerable lives, and the blood in Eva's veins now tied her not only to the victim, but to the architect of the system itself. And when she told Grayson, he didn't speak for a long time, just held her hand, like it was the last real thing in the world. That night, they sat in a cheap motel room eating takeout with the evidence spread across the bed. And when she asked him if he still believed they could survive this, he looked at her with eyes that weren't afraid anymore and said, "I don't know what survival looks like yet, but I know it has to start with us, and I'm not walking away. Not now, not ever." It wasn't romantic, it wasn't poetic, it was quiet and honest and exactly what she needed, because what came next wasn't headlines or lawsuits, it was a subpoena. Eva was being called to testify not just about her mother's case, but about the recent death of Marla Reyes and the possible connection between Wolf Biomedical and military-funded trials in 3 different states. It meant cameras. It meant risk. It meant exposure. But she agreed not because she wanted justice, but because she couldn't keep pretending that survival was enough. Grayson stood beside her every step of the way, never once telling her to stop, never asking her to wait, even when his board threatened to remove him again, even when his name was dragged through the mud, even when former partners started pulling out of contracts and investors demanded his resignation. He stood and said, "This is what it means to build something real." On the morning of her testimony, Eva dressed slowly, her hands shaking as she buttoned the blouse over her growing belly, and when she stepped into the courtroom, she didn't feel brave. She felt terrified, but she also felt ready. She told the truth not in anger, but in clarity. She named names, dates, voices she remembered, and when she finished, there was silence. Not applause, not comfort, just the sound of something breaking open. The news spread fast. Headlines filled every corner of the internet, but Ava didn't read them. She sat in the apartment holding a sonogram in one hand and Grayson's hand in the other and whispered, "I'm tired." And he replied, "Then rest. I'll keep watch." And she believed him. That night, they didn't talk about the company or the press or the trial. They talked about names for the baby. They talked about what kind of world they wanted to raise a child in. They talked about planting a tree in memory of Anna and Marla and the parts of themselves they had to bury just to become who they were now. Eva still didn't call it love. Not yet. Not because it wasn't, but because she knew love wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice. And, in every moment of silence between them, Grayson kept choosing her. And maybe that was all the answer she ever needed. Spring arrived quietly that year without drama or headlines, just longer days and warmer light filtering through the windows of a house no one outside their world really knew existed, the city behind them, the chaos behind them. Even the names they once carried now felt distant, like they belonged to other versions of themselves. And maybe they did, because Eva no longer moved like someone waiting to be punished. She moved with a softness that had learned to grow through pain. And Grayson no longer walked like a man obsessed with legacy. He walked like someone who had finally understood what it meant to build something worth losing everything for. Their mornings were slow and gentle, with laughter that didn't need permission and touch that didn't ask for forgiveness. Mateo adjusted faster than either of them expected, drawing pictures of family that always included a tree, a house, and 3 people smiling wide beside a crib labeled Baby Hope Eva, kept the sonogram in the kitchen drawer next to spoons and cinnamon. And every time she reached for sugar, she saw it and smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because she had chosen this life not as a consolation but as a beginning. Grayson spent his afternoons building a new company, one that funded ethical research and offered full transparency to patients and families, one that bore neither his grandfather's name nor his father's shadow, and for the first time he felt like he was creating something not because it was expected, but because it was right. They didn't speak of the past often, but when they did, it no longer burned. It simply existed like a book they had both read and survived, and sometimes when the nights were quiet and the air smelled like clean earth, they sat outside under the stars, hands intertwined, no words needed because the silence was no longer a threat. It was a gift. On one of those nights, just weeks before her due date, Eva leaned into him and whispered, "I used to think love was something soft, something fragile, but it's not. It's the choice to keep going when you're exhausted and scared and unsure. It's the decision to stay when leaving would be easier." And Grayson turned to her, smiled, and said, "Then let's keep choosing it, even when we don't know what comes next." She laughed quietly, kissed his shoulder, and replied, "Then let's keep building it from nothing, over and over, until nothing becomes everything." And when the baby arrived, it wasn't under perfect conditions. It was messy and painful and raw. But when they placed her in Eva's arms and she felt that first cry echo through her chest, she knew in her bones that every scar, every secret, every moment that nearly destroyed her had led to this, to a new life, a new light, a new legacy. And they named her Elena, not after power, not after money, but after memory. After a woman who had tried to protect truth and paid the price. And when Eva whispered that name against her daughter's skin, she didn't feel like a survivor. She felt like a mother. And Grayson looked at them both with something in his eyes that wasn't awe, but peace. And maybe that was the real ending, not the birth, not the justice, not the redemption, but the quiet truth that two broken people can choose each other again and again until the world finally learns to stop breaking them